All right, perfect. College prep affirms contention 1 is SDRs. Allow 21 explains created by the IMF that SDR or special drawing right is a reserve asset that can be traded between countries in exchange for liquidity. Each time the IMF decides to issue a new allocation of SDRs, the organization is basically acting as an international central bank. Plant 20 explains an SDR allocation would allow countries to access hard currencies at a low interest rate, much lower than borrowing on international markets. SDRs are crucial for combating recessions, as Ambrose 10 warns these payments come with no strings attached. So unconditioned funds derived from SDR conversions help to counter domestic recessions. For example, Safa in 2009 explains that the IMF launched a general SDR allocation in early 2008 to help the global economy avoid a Great Depression. Thankfully, the IMF is stepping in just in time for the COVID recession. As stated by the IMF this year, a new SDR allocation to support global recovery from the COVID-19 crisis will free up badly needed resources for member countries to help fight the pandemic, including to support vaccination programs and other urgent measures. Blakeslee 21 writes these SDRs will represent a 10% boost to developing countries' international reserves, and in some cases double that amount. The impact is twofold. The first, as in Cow 20 explains, SDRs could have a profound financial effect, building confidence among investors and revitalizing economic growth. Even more, Fofec 21 writes the recovery required for the world to return to pre-pandemic GDP levels will remain elusive in the absence of such a strong and well-coordinated international response. Reversing the effects of COVID is key, as the UN concludes COVID-19 could push 500 million people into poverty in developing countries. The second impact is that Shalal in 2021 writes the IMF's reserves could provide the money needed to vaccinate 70% of the population in lower and middle-income countries. Gamma 21 laments that if countries wait to be vaccinated for years, the virus will keep mutating to the point that the first vaccines lose effectiveness, which Karam 21 writes will cause another pandemic, one more deadly and widespread. The World Bank writes a future pandemic has the potential to kill tens of millions of people. Contention 2 is a stamp of approval. Stubbs 15 writes the presence of IMF programs serves as a catalyst for donors because they signal policy credibility, providing a stamp of approval to borrowing countries. Thus, IMF recipients are 25% more likely to receive budget support. Crucially, this funding is for development, as Renzio 11 affirms the IMF played a major role in donor financing through the financing of infrastructure. This is key, as Mahembi 18 confirms aid dispersed in infrastructure was responsible for lifting 10 million people out of poverty each year. Even more, these policies reduce foreign dependence, as Mahembi concludes this aid jumpstarts economic growth and initiates a virtuous cycle whereby investment generates income and thus raises the economic return to further investment. Contention 3 is the environment. The IMF knows the climate is key, as Hawkins 20 writes IMF packages involve an 80% subsidy rate for renewable energy production, calibrated to achieve an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. The time is now, as the IMF in 2021 writes green recovery plans will be reflected in IMF-supported programs, which include public investment projects focused on boosting climate-smart technologies. This is key, as Duke 18 quantifies 153 million deaths linked to air pollution could be avoided worldwide if governments reduce emissions. Contention 4 is stablecoin. Naidu 20 writes stablecoins are crypto assets that maintain a stable value against a target price. These can be adopted by central banks to create countrywide cryptocurrency access. The IMF is key to stablecoin adoption in two ways, and the first is cooperation, as the IMF is directly working to facilitate country-to-country crypto exchanges. CoinDesk writes the IMF will have the capabilities to facilitate government-backed cryptocurrency transactions by 2025, and indeed, Adrian 19 writes the fund is well positioned to help foster cooperation across countries, sharing information about rapidly evolving developments across economies. The second way the IMF is key is through regulation, as CoinDesk writes by the end of 2022, the IMF will have completed regulatory stablecoin frameworks. Such a framework leads to global stablecoin adoption, as Goldsmith explains an international standard for best practices allows government-backed cryptocurrency to flourish while limiting the potential dangers. The IMF is the only actor capable of establishing such regulations, as Guerra 16 affirms that with resources of $300 billion, the IMF is the most powerful of all international institutions, which is why Goldsmith concludes that an organization best equipped to handle oversight of cryptocurrencies is the IMF. Crucially, these stablecoins create financial booms, as Angelo 19 writes stablecoin provides access to banking with less volatility, and South 18 continues this tech removes the need for banks because all that's needed is the internet. Thus, Angelo concludes the adoption of stablecoins can open access to the 1.7 billion unbanked and poor, which PYM 18 concludes that blockchain technology can lift billions out of poverty.
All right, do you mind sending a case talk?
Yeah, of course. I'll just.
Okay, and then while you're sending that, I'm going to send out a form real quick. Okay, so our case that we'll read contains non-graphic descriptions of sex work, and there's more details on the form, but if everyone could just fill this out, this is just an opt-out form. It's completely anonymous, and regardless of whether or not you decide to opt out, you should select yes or no, and then we'll start case once we get all the results. Okay, I think we're waiting on one more person, so. Okay, we've gotten all the results. We'll take a little bit of prep right before. Starting now. All right, that was 15 seconds. Josh will start case read.
Okay. So I'm going to put the cards before. It's going to be a little fast. It shouldn't be too bad, but just in case any tech issues happen, I'm going to send out the cards before. Okay. I just sent it. Okay. Anyone not ready?
Just give me a second to make sure I received that.
Okay.
All right.
I got it.
Okay. Okay. Anybody not ready then? Schuyler and our negate our sole contention is Orientalism. First, an observation. The IMF as an actor has had and continues to have perverse Orientalist objectives, specifically its globalization agenda as a tool of Western plunder. Leo 5. Under globalization, the privileged few are benefited and disguised the real intention by reproducing ideological discourse such as Orientalism in order to restructure the world economically to keep its hegemony over the world in the 21st century. Emerging Asian capital will see by Washington as strategic, easy access to market and a target to conquer. Simultaneously, to achieve these ends, the IMF is Orientalist in perpetuating Western economic models and otherizing Asian development. Leo 5. In the flawed and hasty application of the Western model development, IMF played a role as a savior of the world dominant discourse by the West that the economic development of East Asia was miraculous. But after the crisis, the IMF produced the cronyism, corruption, and lack of transparency. When the crisis hit, the IMF prescribed inappropriate solutions, neoliberalism. There's no room for others who are different from us. Orientalist attitudes that deeply embedded in the West and of the subtext of the East Asian financial crisis. Eastern collectivist worldviews are invalidated as mere pathways on the road to Western individualism. Subpoint is the Asian financial crisis. IMF ruined stability and caused the crisis in two ways. The first is capital account liberalization. Siglet 17 funds. The IMF argued that full liberalization would help the region grow faster, but the East Asia had no need for additional capital, but still was pushing on these countries in the late 1980s. And the single most important factor leading to the crisis, no country could have withstood the sudden change in investor sentiment that reverses huge inflow to huge outflows. Investors put their funds elsewhere. In the case of Thailand, the reversal amounted to 7.9% of GDP. Second is contractionary policies. Still at 17 funds, the economies of East Asia needed stimulation. The IMF pushed exactly the opposite course, made the recession far worse than it needed to be. It advocated the equivalent of a balanced budget amendment, not to stimulate the economy through fiscal expansion, but for corporate and financial restructuring to help bail out America and other foreign creditors. As a result, Siglet 17 concludes in Indonesia, 75% of businesses were put into distress, and in Thailand, 50% of bank loans became non-performing. Subpoint B, structural adjustment. The West produces techno-Orientalism to make Asian people a force of robots designed to produce and manufacture for the West. Row 16, the discourse is focused on construing its people as a labor force in giant consumer markets constructed as competitors and therefore threats. Japan creates the technology, China is the technology. Asian nations serve as scapegoats for corporate decisions to move service and manufacturing jobs abroad, and endless sources of Chinese workers steal the visionary vocabulary of Asians as cogs of the hyper-production maintains inhumanity of Asian labor. This is Orientalist dominance is achieved through IMF imposed model of development on 20. Economically seeking areas of influence to impose policies of monopoly along with brutal extraction of resources under the principle of free market policies that protect aid to the global South countries. The IMF rules such as privatization, state services, and currency devaluation and cheap labor led to the massive entry of foreign corporations without safety net for labor conditions and rights, and takes advantage of women's lack of resources for justice. Subpoint C is squashing alternatives. Without the IMF, East Asia would have been more successful. Stiglitz 17 explains the countries of East Asia had fewer downturns over the previous 2 decades than any other advanced industrial economy. If East Asia was vulnerable, it was a result of the IMF. Additionally, they wanted to build Brazilian crisis response system. Stiglitz 17. Japan offered $100 billion to create the Asian Monetary Fund in order to finance the required stimulative actions, but the IMF squelched the idea, and the IMF joined in, did not want competition in its own domain, providing a real challenge to American leadership and control. On to framework. Prioritize our impacts. A, affirming Orientalism into racism perpetuates as a corrupt method. Even if there are benefits, don't vote for the positive side of effects of a problematic system because it justifies more harmful policies for speculative gains and creates policy failure. B, Orientalism leads to a military intervention. Stoiter 09 finds Orientalism allows us to fabricate alien enemy effectively. The more shadowy, unclear, ambiguous face of the enemy, the more urgent propaganda must fabricate an enemy we believe we know. Instead of listening to multiple stories, we fill the silence with war. Terrorists stand for all Arabs, and weapons cannot yet distinguish the combatant and civilian target. Racism at large lumps together people into a single mass of all variety of individual humanity. The metaphor of the mass comes to murderous, justifying indiscriminate killing. Every citizen of the enemy country becomes indistinguishable and justifiable, for a war is total. They're all a part of the same big brown pile of dirt. Third, prefer our scholarship. Theirs guarantees failure because there is no constructive improvement. Leo 5. The IMF is guided by ideology and flawed in its policy prescriptions. Decisions were made on the basis of ideology without considering the effects that it would have on the people in these countries. Rarely did I see forecasts about what the policies would do to poverty, and explicates here the Orientalist attitude that is deeply embedded in the West.
We're going to call briefly before cross. Starting. All right, that was 3 seconds used.
Ready for cross?
I'm ready.
You can have the first.
All right. Sure. So let's talk about your first link on the Asian financial crisis.
Yeah.
Is the link just that like IMF pushing liberalization is bad?
It's that it caused the crisis.
All right. Sure. But would liberalization have happened without the IMF?
Not the specific liberalization the IMF did, which was capital account liberalization, meaning that it basically slashed all regulations for how investors could move their money in and out of the Asian markets. Can I have a question?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about your pays. At the bottom of your C4, you say that this is stablecoin. Just clarifying, you say it at the bottom, blockchain can lift 1.7 billion out of poverty. So just to confirm, stablecoin is a form of blockchain.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, you can have a question.
The blockchain encompasses a lot of things, and one of those.
I understand. Yeah, you can have a question.
Cool. So let's talk about an author you read.
Sure.
So you cite a lot of cards by the author Joseph Stiglitz. What book are you citing these cards from?
Globalization and its discontents revisited in the.
All right. And when was this book originally written? Like the original version?
The original was 02. The updated, which we're quoting from, is 17.
Yeah. All right. And as of 2020, what does Joseph Stiglitz think of the IMF?
He thinks he was right about what they did in 2000 and whatever, or in 1994 or whatever.
All right, but what does he think about the IMF going forward?
I don't know.
He thinks it's reformed a lot and is no longer having any of the harms that he used to write about, right? Like he thinks that the harms he used to write about aren't that
That's
true.
not at all true. He does not. Joseph Stiglitz does not go out and say, I was wrong in my book, Globalization and its Discontents. He continues to reinforce that he was correct, that the IMF did really bad things in that time period, in that crisis.
All right, he might still think that the IMF was not good in one crisis, right? But if we win that he thinks or if we win that the IMF is going to be good
No.
in the future?
No, because first of all, you would need to link in a framework with a specific example in Asia. Second of all, the problem is that even if you like win speculative reform, you would also have to respond to the fact that inherently the IMF is Orientalist and its purpose is Orientalist, which is also a link in a framework. So you'd have to, I mean, like, yes, you can make arguments, but I'm saying that winning that alone is not enough to win either round.
All right. I mean, we're obviously going to respond to.
Yes, I would anticipate
the
that.
rest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I have a question? When are SDRs going to be implemented?
They're talking about a $650 billion allocation. It's currently going through the official like approval process, and they're going to be allocated by the end of the summer.
Okay, so by the end of the summer, is that enough time to respond to COVID, or like is that like?
That's time.
Okay, yeah, you're right. You're right.
Are you all taking prep?
Yeah, I'll show you my timer.
Oh, I don't care. I just needed to know.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to show you when I started. No. All right, it's 150, right? It's going to be it's going to be on the top on like framing stuff, link level, and then link level down the case, and then more framing at the bottom probably.
When you say framing, do you mean the framework they read at the bottom?
Well, no,
Or-
it's sort of top level. I'm just going to talk about why Orientalism is not a good lens to view the debate from, and then it's going to be like onto their specific arguments, and then I'm going to do like weighing at the bottom.
Cool.
All right, is everyone ready? They say view the lens from like whatever is beneficial in stopping Orientalism. We would say liberalism isn't perfect or historically innocent. It's the most practical way of organizing power for radical societal change. Any alternative throws off 50 years of politics change and seeds politics. Debate is also a product of liberalism, so any values that they see in deliberating proves liberalism counter its own excesses. Isaac 18 writes that liberals express alarm about Trump democracy as a complex, fragile form of politics. The combination was neither inevitable nor innocent. Yet liberal democracy represents the most practical way of organizing power, and every effort to install an alternative has resulted in disaster. We need a movement strengthened by by cumulative victories. Mass politics is unlikely given the current form of social life. Does not follow political organization ought to be disparaged. Radical change will not mitigate different political change, which means Orientalism never solves. Making the choice of no capitulation, but political responsibility to go for what benefits the most people overall. Choice not preclude any other choices. It makes sense to say I support this policy now when the alternative is much worse. At the same time, a work for a future in which better choices are available. The choices they talk about simply aren't available. There's no way of ever solving it for what they talk about. But then sweeping theories of radical ingenuities on ontological differences ignore the nuances of actual struggles that strategically repurpose settler categories. This comes Rosenau 19, who finds that focusing on radical ontological differences lead to reification of differences in danger of ignoring actual struggles and demands on the ground. Those might well emerge out of ingenious modernity rather than instance of difference. Some indigenous people formulate a hegemonic vision valid for everyone, and to use modern notions such as citizenship rather than rejecting an irreconcilable difference. Aiming to make generic conclusion for global issues pushes abstraction further away from advocacy of the concrete. This has real-life consequences for actually existing decolonial struggles. The desire for making a generic argument about related ontologies harbors the danger of making a huge variety of demands and struggles in tension with each other commensurable. This goes back to a lack of actual engagement with practical practice. It's also related to what sort of knowledge is produced and valued in the Western economy. Knowledge is abstract, generic, and applicable beyond to a specific context. But let's go to the link level debate. They say that the West controls the IMF. They say that's not true. It's reforming. There are opponents' arguments are outdated. Gallagher 20 explains the IMF has shifted from a one-size-fits-all policy to individually tailored plans, which helps these countries they talk about eliminating conditionality and austerity. Indeed, Bella 15 reports that the IMF is moving toward a less neoliberal, more Keynesian approach to development, and O'Brien 14 specifies that this IMF is now anti-austerity and pro-redistribution. In fact, structural adjustment programs that my opponents talk about in their first contention were actually eliminated years ago. This solves back for all of their harms. It means we have the only risk of offense moving forward. They say the U.S. controls a large majority of the quotients, and Asian countries don't have them. But the IMF is actually reforming. China's calculated quotient share rose from 6% to 7.5%, which places it ahead of Japan, but still behind the U.S. with 17.8%. We're seeing Asian markets actually getting more benefit in the IMF. On East Asia prices specifically, the U.S. Treasury writes that IMF catalyzed international response to the economic downturn that mitigated the crisis in the IPS concludes that without the IMF, the crisis would have been more severe. But let's go to their first subpoint. First, uniqueness. There was no liberalization before the IMF. Ecol 98 finds that, for example, in Africa, regime says super restricted trade regimes, the only risk of offense is AF. And then secondly, Joyce 05 finds the IMF never pressured nations to liberalize faster than they're willing to go. Further, the IMF just provided support to liberalized nations. There's two implications. The first is terminal defense. The IMF doesn't pursue liberalization, but secondly, it turns the argument because the IMF's advice and ensures countries don't liberalize too fast. Let's go to the second subpoint. Delegate, because TR 21 the IMF has shifted to prioritizing massive social investment instead of SAPs. SAPs no longer exist. Blossom 21 explains that IMF leaders are moving away from the previously neoliberal economic perspective, saying an academic shift to promoting expansionary policy. Then turning, Group of 20 terminalizes the IMF programs, increases public investment by 19% for two reasons. First, IMF institutes reforms that maximize government revenue in the long term, but then secondly, debt relief provided by the IMF frees up fiscal space for governments to invest in social and economic programs. On their third subpoint, the IMF is comparatively better. Think 16 finds since other markets incorporate risk factors into investment decisions, IMF interest rates are actually considerably lower than other investors. This means that compared to the counterfactual countries, spend less on debt repayment and have more capital to stimulate the economy, which is better for Asian economies overall. We can't solve for anything that's happened in the past. We say it's most important to prioritize what's going forward in the world. Things like SDRs and stablecoins are the best way to provide equitable access to financial markets for Asian countries, which is why if you expand stablecoin access and give everyone access to financial market, we solve for
That's time.
It's 4:07. There's a 15-second grace period.
No.
A 10-second grace period, but I was like finishing a sentence.
There's not a grace period.
Can I get a speech doc? Just give me a heads up when you send it.
Okay, I sent the framing, and then Claire's sending all the link stuff.
Okay, we'll wait until we get it to start.
Just to clarify, I forgot to delete the third turn on subpoint A, but
But
that's the one that's in smaller font and that Elliot didn't read. And then some of the stuff at the bottom was analytics, so it's not in the speech doc.
Okay. Where is the framing?
It's all. I sent the framing, and then Claire sent all the links, all the stuff.
Sounds good. And to clarify, the third turn was not read, right?
The one that's in small font.
Okay, so that was not read? Cool. Josh and I will call and we'll start prep once we get connected. Starting. Right, we're stopping prep at 125. You mind just sending the card for SAP's reform?
The TR evidence, yeah, Claire's sending. Is there
Cool,
any
nice.
evidence you need?
Let me make sure. Joyce 05. Just give me a heads up when you send it.
Okay, I'll just send the evidence on social spending increases, and then do you want the Gupta evidence too? The Gupta evidence was that
Yeah, can you send, or I wanted the TAR evidence and the Joyce evidence.
yeah, the PR evidence, I think I tagged wrong, but I'm sending it now.
Cool.
I'm sending the social sending it in. Clara, you already sent. Okay.
I sent Joyce.
Yeah, Joyce already.
Okay, I'll let you know when I get both of them.
The Clements evidence, I think, is the one you're looking for.
Sounds good. Oh, I see Joyce is in a book. Okay, that's fine. We'll call and we'll start prep once we get connected. Starting. All right. If everyone's ready, I'll start. The order is going to be doing framing at the top, and then I'll address their new responses on the framework, and then I will move on to frontlining our case, and then I'll go into their case. Sound good to everyone? Okay. On the framework, Orientalism outweighs and turns their case. Firstly, it turns their case because their impacts don't matter. The AFC happened because of the lack of financial sustainability. This proves that the IMF has racist intentions. Orientalism is just an offshoot of colonialism, which proves that the IMF has colonialist tendencies and proves that their policies are inherently going to fail in the future. Even if you think they're ahead on material benefits, it's irrelevant because we're winning that they're promoting a racist institutions. They've conceded the Lee evidence from framing that says that the IMF is inherently Orientalist at heart, and that's why as an educator, you should have a moral side constraint against that. But secondly, they dropped our framing that says Orientalism is the most important because of the military impact. We told you that it justifies invasion in areas like the Middle East and in Asia, like US bases in Okinawa led to them hurting the environment and hurting the people, which means that Orientalism is always going to come first in terms of the impact level as well. Let's go into their framing. First off, they say group the responses about how like debate is expressing it and how like we have to have a practical discussion for it. First off, we're critiquing Orientalism. They've conceded that the IMF is an institutionist Orientalist. Second, radical change is actually effective. You have to evaluate the implications and the root causes of that radical change and of the structural oppression that's happening in the status quo. They're just addressing the symptoms and not the actual disease, which is Orientalism within the West. Then they say that we're ignoring actual structures because we're not concrete. Firstly, this turns their case. We told you that the IMF imposes neoliberal ideologies, and that's Lee from case on a blanket statement upon all these nations, which actually proves that the IMF is the institution that's being abstract. But secondly, we gave you specific links. And isolated scenarios for you, which proves that we're not ignoring actual struggles. But third, these local banks like the Asian Monetary Fund, which would have stepped in, are actually much more targeted. They actually do targeted poverty reduction, whereas the IMF doesn't. Let's go into the case front lines. First off, group the responses about reform. Number one, our impacts are historical analyses of how the IMF has caused path form. So even if you grant them any present reforms, they're just solving the structural de-development that the IMF created. Second of all, they've conceded that they're inherently Orientalist at heart, which means that they're never going to reform. But third, there's no link. Power structures within stop reform. Lin 08 explains that blocking far-reaching forms of the IMF governance structure is the unwillingness of European countries to give up their control over an excess share of quotes and quotas. Group their responses about how the Asian markets would have done better would have done better and are actually growing the status quo. They would have been worse without the IMF. First off, even if the side effects of the IMF intervention are good, that doesn't make it a moral action and absolve it of its racism. Second off, the root cause of the AFC wasn't sovereign debt. The government had a surplus, which means that they would have been empirically successful. That's confirmed by Malaysia, which imposed capital controls, and without the IMF to slow the crisis, they recovered 3 times as fast. Third, there are better alternatives. They completely dropped their subpoint C, like the Asian Monetary Fund would have offered better alternatives. Let's go into liberalization. First off, you can group the responses about how liberalization is inevitable. The point is that liberalization is bad. We told you that it decreases worker regulation, specifically the way the IMF does it, because they impose structural adjustment programs. Secondly, we'd say that Asian markets were already liberalizing slowly. Prefer this because the West paints the East as like mysterious and shadowed, which essentially takes out any benefits from liberalization. On structural adjustment, briefly, they say that they increase investment. This doesn't matter. This is just the IMF theorizing, and it neglects the warrants. Prefer ours because it's actually historical analysis. On the fact that there are actually more risk factors for banks, first off, bailouts would be better. Their evidence doesn't actually account for the fact that the AMF would have existed and provide better conditions on their case. On SDRs, there's no solvency. Alternatives exist that the IMF crushed. Kapur 16 explains that the ABD was planning to launch a unit of exchange called ACU, which would have provided liquidity. But third, turn it because SDRs make debt restructuring less likely, as Hill 21 explains that they go off to pay off debt to private Western creditors, which makes restructuring forgiveness of the loans less likely. This reproduces debt trapping. Third, there's no link. The SDRs aren't actually enough. Writer 20 explains that they go to wealthy countries, and Africa would just be allocated 7% of the total, and countries actually lose money, as the IMF explains that a member must pay a subscription of up to 25% and SDRs further quota. On the impact level, turn it because the IMF got us here. Healthcare spending in these developing nations, which continues in their world, is why the COVID response failed. On investment, first, turn it because the jobs are horrible working conditions designed to serve the West and exploit domestic people. Joseph Stiglitz explains that forcing a development country to open up to imported products that would compete with industries have disastrous consequences, and jobs have been systemically destroyed. Trade liberalization leads to the decline of small firms. Second, turn all their evidence is about speculation, cross-apply Mariotti. Their rhetoric doesn't actually end up with their actions. On the climate change argument, first, turn it, there's no policy shift. Their evidence is speculation, and the IMF is just a proposal that concludes that countries aren't following. On stablecoin, turn it because CBDCs kill the informal economy and also create transaction fees that generate a welfare loss of up to 45%. Ready for cross?
Sure. All right. Wait, actually, let's run a little bit of talk. Yeah. First, can we get a speech though?
Sure. I'm just deleting the stuff I didn't read. Okay, it should all be sent.
It's sent.
Yeah.
Okay. As soon as I get it, let's start cross.
Okay.
I haven't got it yet. I'll let you know.
Maybe just wait a second. If you don't get it in a bit, I can try resending.
I just got it. So, are you ready for cross?
Yeah, you can go ahead and
I take the first question. Skylar, have we had radical change in the last 50 years? Radical social change.
Not in the IMF, no.
Well, no. I'm not talking about the IMF generally. I'm talking about a neoliberal system that the global economy participates in. Have we had radical change in which we've seen minorities and populations who have historically been oppressed rise up and get more power? Well, it's relevant to the framing debate. It's just a question. Have we seen radical societal change?
Can you explain to me how it's relevant to the framing debate?
Because you tell me that you vote down a historically orientalist system and a historically racist system, but our Isaac evidence says
of the IMF.
Sure, but what our Isaac evidence says is that even if liberalism and these organizations aren't perfect, it's the most practical way of organizing power for radical
social change has the IMF created?
No, I'm not talking about the IMF. I'm talking about liberalism and neocolonial, or like liberalism as a whole in terms of like a tool for radical change, right?
Yeah, but you have to prove that this applies to the institution we're debating, which is the IMF.
Well, we'll get to that on the link level. I'm asking you questions.
I'd like to ask you a question. Give me one example of a radical social movement the IMF has supported.
I mean, the IMF is right now giving access to global financial markets through the regulation of stablecoins.
That is not a radical social change. Come on.
Wait, giving people in poverty access to financial markets.
Giving people
apply social change.
like imposing
people
neoliberal
have been
ideologies that
locked
allow
out
them
of
to
financial
spread
market.
free market policies through stablecoin is certainly not a radical change. Like,
Well, 1.7 billion people in the past have been locked out of financial markets. That's what evidence indicates. By giving them access to
okay,
global
and
financial markets,
what underlying structural oppression do they face as a result?
they're locked out of financial markets. They can't access currency. They can't. They're in poverty.
That's
right?
not a form of structural oppression. Like poverty is.
Poverty
because-
isn't a form of structural oppression.
No, poverty is a form of structural oppression, but you haven't proven that the IMF is the unique institution that can lift them out of poverty.
I mean, we don't
We
need to.
proved you that there are alternative
yeah, we
methods
do.
of development. For example, the Asian Monetary Fund, which was quashed by the IMF, that could have done the same thing, if not better. Would you like a question?
We'll talk more about it on the link level. Yeah, let's talk about reforms. You tell me the IMF is not reforming,
Yes.
right? So then why is the quota for Asian countries and China specifically rising in terms of the IMF, in terms of
Because
the share
it has to
of
rise
global
along with their GDP. Like the IMF would violate their own rules if they didn't allow China's quota share to rise.
But the US's GDP is rising as well, is it not?
Yeah, and the US's quota share is also rising. Like it just
No,
moves.
China's quota shares are rising in accordance with the US because they realized that the power structures were not.
No, the quota shares change based off of GDP, and also it's never going to surpass the US.
Okay,
And
what
also,
our
the
evidence
quota
says-
shares don't matter because our evidence is very specific in saying that right now, Western nations still own the majority of the voting, so they can block any radical reform within the IMF.
Sure, we'll talk more about that in our other speeches.
That's the end of Cross.
How much prep, Joe?
One prep, Judge. We had 150 before rebuttal, so it's starting now. Sorry, I just unmuted, but it didn't work. I said that I have that is all of our preps, so.
All right. The order is going to be on the framework in the round, on our case, and then on their case. Is anyone not ready? All right, perfect. Skylar says as an educator you have to vote against a racist institution, but she drops the warrant for why they're reforming. We say even if the IMF was colonialist in the past, they've reformed and the harms they're talking about no longer exist. For further warranting, Elliot gives at the bottom of his speech where he says you should prioritize future-looking impacts because there's no way we can solve for the harms of the past, but we can always ensure that we're reversing these structures in the future. The only way you're going to do that is by whichever side makes the most positive progress in the future. Then Skylar says the roots of the IMF will always be Orientalist, but there's no warranting for why that matters as long as we win that their policy is no longer Orientalist going forward. They have no offense under their framework. She also says you automatically accept liberalism, but as Elliot said, liberalism isn't perfect or historically innocent, but it's the most practical way of organizing power for radical societal change. Any alternative throws 50 years of positive change and seeds politics. Skylar herself says that radical change is key, and that's the Isaac evidence, which is entirely dropped. With that, let's go on to our case. On SDRs, there's this term of health spending, but Clift 11 finds the IMF had actually encouraged countries to increase health spending by 4% on average. They have no offense here. The responses on infrastructure and environment aren't contextualized at all. The argument we're going for on our side of the flow is stablecoin. The only response to this is this one turn about the informal economy. I have no idea what this even means because they didn't extend a warrant as to why it kills the informal economy. We'd say that's not even true. But then they also say something that people are being forced to pay transaction fees. We'd say the transaction fees for the stablecoin is a lot lower than transaction fees for banks or transaction fees for other cryptocurrencies. That's why more people uniquely get access. At that point, there are no responses on the link level of the contention, so you can extend it. Goldsmith finds that IMF is the only organization that can regulate stablecoin because of its scope and influence, which is key to global adoption of stablecoin. They concede this. Then CoinDesk confirms that IMF will have completed regulatory stablecoin frameworks by 2022. Ansel in 2019 writes, stablecoin provides access to banking with less volatility, which expands access to 1.7 billion people and catalyzes massive economic growth that PYM confirms can lift billions out of poverty. This is a fundamental prerequisite to all of their offense because they say that IMF has locked out Asian markets, has locked out developing markets, but the only way to give people in developing nations access to capital, access to banks, access to the tools they need in order to better their own situation is through equitable access to currency, which in this case, the only currency that can reach them is stablecoin. They can see this. But now on their warrants, on liberalization, the Joyce evidence Elliot reads in rebuttal is really, really good. She just says Asian markets were already liberalizing slowly, but the Joyce evidence explicitly says the IMF made sure countries continue to liberalize slowly at the same pace they were liberalizing and never open their markets too fast. They have no offense on the link level here. Call for the card if you want. Unlocking out other markets, these alternatives will never work. Bergson in 98 warns, absent the IMF, the market itself would be left to resolve crises. Crucially, the volatility of capital markets would worsen currency volatility, resulting in sharper recessions. This alone wins us the round because it co-ops all their solvency. In a world with the default countries would be devoid of investment. It also co-ops and magnifies their offense, as Bergson furthers, absent the IMF, deeper crises would require harsher trade and capital controls. Independently, we turn their austerity arguments. It's really clear that they don't have any offense. The IMF is reforming. You always vote on stablecoin.
Okay, we're gonna call and start prep.
How much prep do you all have?
I think we have around minute 25 left. So that sounds right. All right, starting prep. All right, we just used another minute 15, so we have 10 seconds left.
So it's going to be framing. It's like people did framing in a bunch of different places. It's going to be the framing, then it's going to be the neg, then the f. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyone not ready? They conceded both reasons why Orientalism, any risk of offense on our case, turns their case and ends the round. The first is the fact that the system itself is racist because the IMF was specifically designed to be Orientalist and to be racist. It's inherently racist. They conceded the analysis that structurally, because the West will always control a majority of the votes, they can never have full structural change. They just have rhetorical shifts with never showing policy actions, which is why even in their COVID loans, they're still doing austerity. This means you're rejecting Orientalism off the bat because even if they get some positive side effects, the policymaking will always be better if you address the root cause, which is the racist system. The second is the 100% conceded war argument. Orientalism always creates the preconditions of war because we otherize countries, which makes it easy for us to justify intervention, which A, is bad in and of itself, a reason to reject Orientalism, and definitely outweighs their case on severity because war triggers poverty and death, but B, links into their case because you can never have stable development if you're constantly going to war. It's why we've seen the Middle East being stuck in a period of non-development or in significantly less development because the U.S. is intervening every 2 seconds on their arguments. They just say liberal democracy creates radical change. One, they don't read a link into liberal democracy from the IMF. Call for the card is talking about democracy. They don't read a link. Two, they don't give an example where the IMF has promoted active social change or really good social intentions. And our argument is that intentions are and motives are really, really important because it controls how long-term policymaking will be had. We're going for our alternatives argument. Our argument is that the IMF quashed the Asian Monetary Fund, which would have existed without the IMF. That not makes their case because it's the reason why these countries are systematically developed in Asia as a result of the Asian financial crisis is because there was no alternative to the IMF because the IMF quashed it. Second of all, the argument is that the market is the alternative. No, we gave the alternative. It's not market or foreign creditors. It's the Asian Monetary Fund, which our evidence says would have been way better and given way fewer austerity and way better loans, which means that in the time of crisis, Asia would have been significantly better off without the IMF. Moreover, the act of IMF quashing the AMF is an act of Orientalism because it said the Western model was significantly better than the Eastern model of development and basically just said that you are not allowed to have autonomy over your own model of development. This inherently is a link to Orientalism, and because we're winning any semblance of a link to Orientalism, the framing made us really clean. The round is really, really over. Go to their case. They extended an argument that basically just like the fees would have been comparatively better. Here's the problem. They missed the comparative. Our evidence says welfare comparatively is worse off, i.e. like the fees are, our evidence does the comparative and says the fees went up, which is a straight turn on their case because it makes it harder for people to access the arguments they talk about. The second thing is the fact that on their prereq, they just say give a bunch of people access to poverty. One, again, it's a symptom, not the disease. If we prove the root cause is racist, you should always reject that for better policymaking in the future. Second of all, they don't read a link in specific to Asia. Asia was systematically developed by the IMF during the crisis, and vote neg.
All right, ready for grand?
Yeah, sure. You can take the first question if you'd like.
Josh, go ahead. We can't hear you. Or is that just me?
Wait,
I can't hear
me?
you.
Hello?
Yeah, now I can.
No.
Okay, you're good.
I don't have one, Skylar. Do you want one?
Oh, sure. I'll take one then. All right, so let's talk about your liberal democracy's argument on the framing. So how is rejection of Orientalism mutually exclusive with promoting liberal democracy?
What we tell you, right, is that like these IMF policies go hand in hand with this liberalism, and so by rejecting Orientalism, you're also rejecting this.
Wait. My question is, how are they mutually exclusive? How is rejecting Orientalism mutually exclusive with liberal democracies?
We're not saying rejecting Orientalism is bad. We're saying that rejecting these systems, which you say originally perpetuated Orientalism, one, are no longer perpetuating Orientalism anymore, but two, is bad in the fact that the IMF and organizations that promote liberalism is actually the best tool for macro societal change.
Okay, really
so you're saying liberalism is key for societal change, and the IMF promotes liberalism, right?
Yeah.
I just want to clarify.
So on that really quickly though, your evidence is liberal democracy. How does the IMF promote liberal democracy?
No,
it's not liberalism generally.
Liberalism is the liberal democratic system.
IMF promotes like capital account liberalization. That's not the same as promoting democracies. Liberal democracy is different from capital account liberalization. You don't want to link into liberal democracies.
The Western system is in place, right?
What? You don't get a link into liberal democracies if you don't read a link that the IMF helps liberal democracies.
It's about liberalism as an economic.
No, your evidence is about liberal democracies.
I mean, sure, you can make that argument.
I did make that argument.
It's just your evidence. That's just what it says.
I mean, I would say that liberalism and liberal democracy are this part of the same system.
But they aren't. Those are like the structure of governance is entirely different from if I don't have regulations on my capital markets.
Let's say we take you at your best and say that your evidence somehow does say liberal democracies. What country, name me one example, has the IMF implemented a liberal democracy in?
Well, I mean, this wasn't really
I just like one example.
I would say the IMF in general does promote democratic organization.
Can you just give me one example of a country, like just one country?
I don't have an example off the top of my head. I'm sure I could find one if I looked after the round.
Okay, that's fine. Y'all can have a question.
I do have a question.
All right. Yeah. Let's actually go back to the framework.
Sure.
So, just like theoretical question. If we were to win, the IMF policies would no longer be Orientalist in the future. Where does your offense come from off the framework?
That it was Orientalist, and you have to reject that.
Like that's
Still
like
offense.
saying,
The
oh,
res-
the
the re-
institution
oh,
of
go ahead, sorry.
colonialism might have been bad in the past, but it's better now. Like you still reject
So the
it.
U.S.
It was
used to be
colonialist in the past.
so the U.S. was founded off colonialism and Orientalism and racism. So we should just get rid of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, no,
No,
we should get
but
rid of
we
the
should
US.
probably
should get rid
critique
of
the foundations of the
institutions within it.
US.
Like that's why,
That's
like,
what they're
people
doing.
on
That's why
colonialism-
reforms are happening.
That's what
They're
But they're
critiquing
not.
the foundations
Wait, hold
of
on.
the IMF.
No. Your argument is that the U.S. is an example of a place where we shouldn't critique its foundations of?
No, Josh.
We're
Josh.
saying
what
you
I'm
can critique the past of the IMF without rejecting the institution as a whole because the institution has since reformed. And so as long as they're no longer doing
You
that.
can critique the institution of the U.S. and saying it needs to reform without rejecting the U.S. and saying
That's time.
All right. So it's gonna be like on the framing, our offense on crypto, and then their offense on like quashing the Asian monetary fund and the market not being the alternative. All right. All right. The narrative became a lot cleaner in Grand Crossfire because what we were talking about is the fact that if an institution was founded on the ideas of Orientalism or colonialism, it doesn't matter insofar as when we critique the foundation, we're able to come up with a reform, which is why they drop our evidence that says the IMF is now focusing less on neoliberal policies and more on anti-austerity measures and increase in social spending, which is why overall, even if you want to reject the foundation of the institution, we should focus on reforming it in the best way possible and to stop the Orientalism that it was founded on. She says you automatically reject it, but that doesn't make any sense. The roots of the IMF will always be Orientalist. There's no way to ever stop that. There's no reason why that matters. As long as we win that the policy is no longer Orientalist, they have no offense under their framework. Let's go to the Asian financial crisis stuff. They dropped the response that we tell you on the East Asian crisis, specifically the U.S. Treasury writes the IMF catalyzed international response to the economic downturn that mitigated the crisis. The IPS concludes that without the IMF, the crisis would have been more severe. They say that they quashed the Asian Monetary Fund, but what our evidence tells you is that the Asian Monetary Fund wouldn't have the capital regardless, and they actually imposed more austerity. The IMF didn't quash the ADB, it simply had more capital. It was better equipped to respond. That's why the best way to increase equitable access for everyone to financial markets is to critique the foundation of the IMF and enable reforms to happen. Go to our offense of cryptocurrency. Goldsmith finds that IMF is the only organization that can regulate stablecoin because of its scope and influence, which is key to global adoption. CoinDesk confirms that IMF will have completed regulatory stablecoin frameworks by 2022, and the ancillary eventually stablecoin can provide access to banking with less volatility, expanding access to 1.7 billion people in markets like the Asian markets. This is a fundamental prerequisite to their arguments, and it is dropped in every speech. They say the IMF has locked out Asian markets. The only way to give people access to developing nations to financial markets through equitable currency like stablecoin. They say transaction fees go up. No, our evidence specifically isolates that there is no transaction fees on stablecoin when it's regulated through the IMF. Then on their independent offense on like why you reject it, you don't reject the system just because it was founded on institution. You don't reject the U.S. just because it was founded on colonialism. You critique the organization reform. They say it causes war. We are still fundamental prerequisites because that link is poverty, and our poverty reduction is the strongest impact
That's
of 1.7 billion people.
Can you just give me the author name of the evidence that you're referencing in Final Focus about how they have higher interest rates and less money?
We just say that then the reason why the ADB
Can I just see that?
ADB wasn't able to rise because the IMF had more capital.
Can I just see the evidence that you're for that?
Sure.
Cool, thanks.
Wait, also, did you send the stuff that was like our evidence says fees go down or whatever? Did y'all send that?
What?
Did y'all send the IMF or like the RF says like fees go down, your front line to the fees?
I didn't say fees go down. I said there's no fees on.
Yeah, what card was that?
With regulation.
Is that in the case?
I think I read that in-
Which piece of evidence is it for? Also, the thing that the IMF, we don't have a
It's the South card from Case, I think.
South card.
South,
yeah,
okay.
from Case. It's talking about compared to other alternatives.
Like, but where does it say like there are no fees or whatever?
It doesn't say there are no fees. It says compared to other alternatives, there's less transaction fees. And
where in the card? In the South evidence?
The South evidence says that it removes the need for banking and banking fees, which creates equitable access to finance.
Where does it say
It
that?
says more people have access to currency because it removes the need for banks entirely, meaning no hidden costs and no chance local governments. I mean, you can read through the evidence.
Okay, that's fine. That's all right.
Okay, we're gonna call and we'll run the rest of our prep once we connected. Sorry, what is the author name?
It's South.
South.
That's the fees evidence.
Okay, that's fine. Was there an author name for the AMF evidence?
The AMF or the ADB evidence is just analysis that the
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
that the one with the most capital was probably just the one that was able to survive.
Okay, we're gonna call. Starting. Sounds good. Is everyone ready? So the order is going to be addressing the framing at the top, and then I'll move on to the argument about reforms on the framing, and then like I'll sort of address their Lincolns, and I will move on to like extending case, and then on to like any turns on stable coins they extended. Cool. On the framing, any risk of Orientalism outweighs and turns their case. First off, they've conceded that the IMF was designed as an institution of globalization from the West, designed to plunder the East because they see them through an Orientalist lens. But second off, they've completely conceded the war Lincoln. We told you that any risk of Orientalism has justified war in the past because it allows the West to otherwise the East and other areas and justify intervention by dehumanizing these individuals. Josh told you that war links into their poverty impact because war means that you cannot have stable development. Therefore, if we have any risk of Orientalism, they lose their stablecoin argument. On the Orientalism framework, they say that the IMF has reformed. First off, they've cold conceded our evidence from rebuttal into summary. This is that the structure and the voting system of the IMF makes it impossible to actually structurally change it and make it anti-Orientalist. But second off, their evidence is literally just about austerity and doesn't say that they've changed on their Orientalist policies a single time. Austerity is not mutually exclusive with Orientalism. The IMF cannot do austerity and still be Orientalist. But third, even at their best, where there is no colonialist incentive, this is an on-balance resolution, meaning that any past harms of racism are a reason for you to negate because as a moral actor and as an educator, you should never vote for an institution that has even some past harms of racism. At that point, they don't have a link into solving Orientalism. Their arguments on framework are defense at best, and the IMF never becomes anti-Orientalist. They try to read a Lincoln from poverty, but we told you that in order to actually solve for the root cause of poverty, you have to address Orientalism first, because otherwise you're just solving for the symptoms and not the disease. Our argument is that during the AFC specifically and in Asia, the IMF has squashed the Asian Monetary Fund, which actually had more capital and would have imposed lower interest rates and less austerity. They give you one analytic about how the IMF had more capital, but we actually give you carded evidence that indicates otherwise. This is key because it means that one, it non-uniques their case since the AMF would have been able to provide sustainable development and extend monetary inclusivity to everyone in these regions. But B, it also turns their case because this is another link into Orientalism, as the IMF quashing is basically just imposing a Western model and invalidating Eastern methods of development. They tried to extend a turn on AMF, but I already frontlined this like 8 times by saying that the AMF would have stepped in.
College prep, in your final focus, you talk about the U.S. Treasury rights that IMF would have been more severe. Was that a piece of evidence?
Which piece of evidence?
Yeah.
U.S. Treasury says without the IMF, it would have been more severe.
Yeah,
in regards to AMF, if you would please send that evidence.
Of course, yeah.
Do you want the evidence frontlining that too?
No.
Okay.
Roots in that, I'm going to run to the restroom and then I will type up my decision and I'll be right back. Did you send that?
Yeah.
Okay. I am ready. Do we have everyone? Okay. Starting with voting negative, I think the first thing I need to evaluate is the framework debate. It seems that at the end of the debate, it's only a question of reform versus colonialism. Earlier on in the debate, the AF is saying liberalism is a method of change instead, but it seems that we need to prioritize the rejection of Orientalism. It's a moral question to evaluate colonialism, but it's also necessary for good policymaking. At first glance from rebuttal, it seems hard for the affirmative to win when they've mishandled the framework. I'm not sure how liberalism answers are responsive, or why we should look at colonialism or Orientalist structures. Ontology is even mentioned in the rebuttal, but that definitely is not responsive to this part of the debate. I think perhaps the affirmative could have gone more for like future focused better types of arguments. I think you might have had more traction there, but that wasn't really fleshed out in the final focus. It was only fleshed out in the context of like reform good. So if the biggest section of the arguments is reform good, it seems not only like a little new in the summary final focus, but the summary final focus had the IMF reform is impossible because of the way it's structured. I also think it's probably a little tone deaf to be like, you wouldn't reject institutions like the United States for being racist, when in fact people say you should do that. The latter half of that isn't something that plays into my decision, not that you are listening, but is something that you should be aware of. After I decide that the negative is winning the framework, colonialism is the first and most important question. The rest of the debate is pretty easy to resolve because the only offense that college prep extends is the cryptocurrency decreasing poverty, but I don't really know how that resolves anything or grapples with a larger structure as per the colonialism framework. I also think the final focus is probably at least a little true that they probably turn the case or solve portions of the poverty arguments, which means that I am probably voting negative. Questions?
Good run, guys. Thanks for the feedback and such.
Have a good day.
Yeah, thank you for the feedback. Nice found y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.